Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Asia Society Philippines' first digital Asia Society Conversations, the new normal in the workplace. I'm Joy Alampay, the Executive Director of Asia Society Philippines. We work to strengthen relationships, deepen understanding, and we work across our islands, Asia, and the United States. Our projects and programs on education, on leadership and culture, and on policy and cross-country understanding are all intended to inspire a collaborative and shared future for all of us. It is in this spirit of a common and binding tomorrow that we are proud and excited to be hosting all of you today. As we all ask what lies beyond the uncertainties of this pandemic and beyond, we find the answers through meaningful discussions toward a better normal. As we dream of a shared future, there's also no better time to include diversity and inclusion in our conversations. So please join us as we discuss and dissect the importance of promoting SOGIE-inclusive policies in organizations and companies with our experts from the field. And let us make our better normal vision a reality, one conversation at a time. May I therefore express our gratitude to all our partners for making today a reality, the Philippine Financial and Inter-Industry Pride, the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, the Philippine LGBT Chamber of Commerce, Side B Philippines, Lagablab LGBT Network, University of the Philippines Babaylan, Ateneo de Davao Libulan Circle, PANTAY, or the Philippine Anti-Discrimination Alliance of Youth Leaders, Bahaghari, ProudCampaign.Philippines, Bisdak Pride, and Ladlad Party-List. With that, I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator today, Attorney Claire De Leon. Attorney Claire is a queer lawyer, as she deems it, working on gender equality and human rights. She has been involved in the advocacy for almost 10 years, and she currently serves as a lawyer at the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. She's also the Executive Director of Babaylanes and the Secretary General of Lagablab LGBT Network, an alliance of organizations lobbying for the passage of the LGBTQ responsive legislations. Attorney Claire, welcome.
Thank you very much, Ms. Joy, and thank you to Asia Society Philippines for inviting us and for hosting this discussion in time for Pride Month. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Claire De Leon of Lagablab Network. In this discussion, we will talk about promoting inclusion in the workplace through SOGIE-esque responsive policies. We want to raise awareness on the importance of having anti-discrimination policies in Asian countries, especially in the workplace, both for employers and for employees. Our panelists will also share the various campaigns of their organizations and groups towards creating a more inclusive community. Here in the Philippines, for the past 20 years, we have been continuously lobbying for an anti-discrimination legislation. At present, the SOGIE-specific anti-discrimination bill or the SOGIE Equality Bill is still pending in both houses of Congress. Interestingly, just 2 days ago, we might have all heard about this. The United States Supreme Court ruled that it is unlawful for employers to fire any person for being gay or transgender as a violation of their Civil Rights Act. However, unfortunately, we do not have such in the Philippines. And without such anti-discrimination law to protect us, any person may be discriminated against on the basis of their actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, or sex characteristics. This leaves all of us in general, and the LGBT community in particular, vulnerable to discrimination in different contexts and spaces, in schools, in workplaces, or in accessing services. Because of this, people have been refused entry to schools, denied access to adequate health care, excluded from socioeconomic support, rejected from employment applications, or treated unfairly with regard to trainings or promotion, just on the basis of their SOGI. And sometimes it's not even their actual SOGI that matters, but other people's assumptions or perception of their SOGI can lead to this discrimination. Just before 2019 ended, the Office of the President issued Executive Order 100, which institutionalized a diversity and inclusion program. Well, this is a very welcome step towards inclusion of LGBTQI persons. This program merely consolidates and implements existing laws and rules against discrimination on the basis of SOGI, among others. Um, and any additional protection would still have to arise from a law. And since we don't have any law protecting us from discrimination, there's really not much that the program can implement. While there are some cities, municipalities, and provinces that have enacted anti-discrimination ordinances in their localities, this covers a very small percentage of the population, and more than 81 million Filipinos reside outside of these areas. Fortunately, there are private institutions that are starting to implement inclusive policies within their companies and organizations. As we wait for our national laws to catch up, we need these initiatives to build a more inclusive community. Now we will hear from our resource persons about their thoughts and experiences on the subject matter and how companies and organizations in the Philippines and in Asia can implement policies that will make them more LGBTQI inclusive. For this panel discussion, we have four speakers. Our first speaker is currently the regional coordinator of ASEAN SOGIE Caucus, a regional organization that leads collaborative advocacy for human rights and LGBTQI and gender diverse persons in Southeast Asia. A key part of their work is providing training and technical support for LGBTIQ activists in engaging human rights mechanisms. Our first speaker is passionate about human rights education, being able to facilitate several trainings with activists and academics within the region. While on lockdown, they are imagining ways how to infuse contemplative practices into activism. They hold a master's degree in human rights from Mahidol University. Let's hear it from Ryan Silver.
Good afternoon, everyone. Hi, Claire. Thanks for the kind introduction.
Mhm. Can you give us a short description of what your organization does before we
All right, sure.
introduce the other speakers?
Okay, sure. Yeah, our organization, as you've said, we do work in 11 countries in Southeast Asia. Our
Mhm.
primary work is to support local activism in engaging human rights mechanisms in the national, regional, and global levels. We support groups in preparing reports and lobbying government to ensure SOGI policies are being integrated into, say, for example, UN resolutions, national government policies, etc. We also do have a program called South-South Solidarity, which I'm going to talk about later, but it's practically empowering local LGBT groups and ensuring their resilience amidst the ongoing crisis. Back to you, Claire. Thanks.
Thank you. Our next speaker is part of the BPO workforce. He has been in the LGBT advocacy for 20 years in various LGBT orgs. Professionally, he has experience as a writer, corporate trainer, and public speaker. Currently, he is a training and quality director in one of the country's largest BPO companies and is supporting various industry verticals. Let's hear it from Farsia of Heidi.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Um, I'm Fire and I'm from Side B Philippines. We are actually an organization that advocates for bi-visibility, but we have other advocacies as well, like SOGIE Education, where we also assist schools and students with research on SOGIE education. And the last advocacy we have is employment equality. We've launched a couple of surveys since we were founded in 2016 about benefits that LGBT plus persons receive through their employment, as well as any experiences that they have specific to their job hunting or talent acquisition. We share this information and data with organizations and people who are interested in understanding the situation of our current LGBT plus community when it comes to employment equality and diversity and inclusion policies in the workplace. Thank you.
Thank you, Fire. Our next speaker has 15 years of experience in international trade relations and public policy development. With a master's degree in international political economy from the University of Manchester, UK, obtained as a British Achieving Scholar, he currently serves as a consultant for multi-sectoral organizations or entities and provides advice on public policy stakeholder engagement, and external economic relations. As a former Philippine lead trade negotiator in ASEAN service sector, he spearheaded the promotion of competitive and innovative industries to deepen the country's engagement in regional cooperation and integration. His involvement in international trade included economic negotiations through the ambit of ASEAN-Japan Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, ASEAN-India Free Trade Area, ASEAN-Australia New Zealand FTA, ASEAN-Korea FTA, ASEAN-China FTA, and various intra-ASEAN trade in services committees. He served as the inaugural Philippine Lead Services Negotiator for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a proposed mega trade deal that will create the world's largest trading bloc, accounting for about half of the world population and 39% of global GDP. As an advocate of greater diversity and inclusion and equality, he provides guidance on vision on businesses as the current chair of the Philippine LGBT Chamber of Commerce, a non-stock, non-profit industry organization of businesses of, by, and for LGBT. Our next speaker is Ron Astili.
Thank you very much, Claire. On behalf of the Philippine LGBT Chamber of Commerce, we're very much excited this afternoon to partner with Asia Society of Philippines and the rest of the LGBT organizations in bringing to the center and front the push for more diversity and inclusion in the workplace and in businesses. As an industry organization, we are here to always support national economic development and ensuring that businesses will always be compliant or will always be a source of hope for the LGBT community in times, especially when we feel a lot of inequalities on the ground and especially now that there are a lot of uncertainties as well. So from the LGBT Chamber of Commerce, we always believe that leadership can always be can always emanate from the LGBT community through the business narrative that we are positively proposing as we do our respective activities throughout the year. So again, we're very much happy to have this session this afternoon.
Thank you, Ron. Our last speaker is a proven operations strategist with 20 years of experience and a solid track record of success in building and managing leadership and functional teams for multinational organizations. He is a board advisor of the Global In-House Center Council of the Philippines, the Industry Association for Global Shared Services Center, and a member of the leadership team of the Philippine Financial and Inter-Industry Pride, the leading voice in workplace inclusion among private organizations in the Philippines. Most recently, he was head of high-level operations at Baker McKenzie's Manila Center. He is currently on a mid-career sabbatical, dividing his time between consultancy work and volunteer opportunities. Let's all welcome Chris Eugenio of PFI.
Thank you, Claire. And thank you for the opportunity to introduce the PFIP. The PFIP, or the Philippine Financial and Inter-Industry Pride, is a collaborative, voluntary, and nonprofit community of practice composed of dedicated representatives from LGBT plus employee resource groups and or human resource diversity teams of private firms in the country. We started with 5 companies in October 2013 and now have over 40 members across multiple industries and locations with our Cebu and Baguio chapters. We are the leading voice and champion of LGBT workplace inclusion. Over the years, demonstrating real commitment to diversity and inclusion, our member firms have provided health and insurance coverage for LGBT couples and families, introduced SOGIE-inclusive HR and admin policies, including use of preferred names in official correspondence, gender-inclusive restrooms and dress codes, and progressive leave policies that recognize the evolving realities of the LGBT plus community. And we're just starting. So happy to be part of this conversation today, Claire.
Thank you very much, Chris. So now we go on to the panel discussion. There will be, in this discussion, I will be asking questions. Some will be directed to all the panelists, and some will be directed towards specific panelists. Later on, we will have time for question and answer to address some questions that the participants, the viewers may have to specific speakers. Okay, let's start. First, why do you think, all of you, why do you think is there a need to come up with specific policies that are responsive to SOGIE? Anyone can answer.
I guess if I may begin, Claire,
Sure.
I think ultimately when we talk about employment, we talk about businesses, we always talk about individuals. And if you talk about individuals, you look into the environment and the culture that we promote in a particular company. And having, for example, an inclusive and a diverse policy or environment in a company actually allows innovation, allows productivity, and allows personal growth. So I think let's not forget that whatever policy we do at the macro level, at the microeconomic level, it all boils down to how it affects individuals. So I think that's the most important reason why we're doing SOGIE-inclusive policies wherever we can.
Anyone else wants to answer?
Claire, in my case, I think we have to frame the discussion of inclusive SOGIE policies in the context of 2 things. One, as a human rights issue, I think it's very important to highlight the principle of non-discrimination, which is integrated in so many human rights instruments and frameworks, including those that are applicable in our context in the Philippines, and at the same time in the context of economic empowerment. It's not just about creating a safe space for workers to engage and earn a living. It's also about earning decent wages to ensure that folks will have access to basic resources, basic necessities to live a life of dignity. And at the same time, to have a sense of dignity to influence one's own community in improving lives of organizations or communities and influencing processes on how to challenge unequal social structures, unequal economic structures that many of us LGBT persons do face. I think it's a reality that we are now facing a double-edged sword. Number one, we are discriminated in many companies, many businesses. It's difficult especially for trans persons to be hired in stable jobs. And now we are also facing an economic crisis. Like in the context of the Philippines, the recent report by the Department of Labor indicates that around 17% of Filipinos are unemployed. I don't know, and we don't have statistics yet, how many LGBT persons have lost jobs so far.
Thank you, Ryan. Chris or Fire, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure.
Go ahead, Chris.
Okay.
Go ahead.
For the PFIP, we feel like it's almost our moral obligation, to really push for SOGIE inclusive policies, mainly because of the privilege that we have. We are supported by multinational corporations, big companies, with who already embrace DNI, maybe in their global headquarters. So it's our job to localize these DNI policies and make sure that local or Filipino LGBT professionals who are employed by these multinationals are also able to partake of the D&I benefits of these global companies. And as with anything in the Philippines these days, it's really the private sector who will have to step up. It's unfortunate that this our sphere of influence is very much limited within the private space, but we see it as an opportunity to create best practices, and to really show what diversity and inclusion look like in a business setting.
Thank you, Chris. Fire?
Yeah, well, for side B, we believe that, in the absence of a national law that would actually cover rights for LGBT plus persons, and this is not yet in place, obviously, it's a great practice for companies to be able to step up, as was mentioned earlier, to provide benefits and support that isn't necessarily mandated by the government to LGBT plus persons at the moment. Inclusive policies from companies can also be created to expand the diversity and talent pool and provide opportunities for all people, regardless of SOGI.
Thank you, Fire. Let me just follow up on some of the thoughts mentioned. As mentioned by Ryan, that this is a human rights issue, and also by Fire that there is still no law protecting us from discrimination. Do you think that there are any other laws or policies in place currently outside of the private sector that may provide us some protection? Let's hear first from Ryan and Fire, and then the others may answer. Ryan, do you have thoughts on this? I think Ryan is having technical difficulties. Fire, do you have
Sure.
thoughts on this? Yeah.
Yeah, the thing that I can
Okay,
think of is
Ryan.
the current UN guiding principles on business and human rights. Of course, this is not yet legally binding. This is something that a framework that is being encouraged towards companies. Of course, the state also has an obligation to monitor and ensure that companies who have, promised to comply to this follow the principles. This would include having equal opportunity policies, which is approved even at the highest level of the company or business, ensuring that there are redress mechanisms inside the company or business in case there are cases of discrimination, harassment, and abuse. Also creating an enabling environment for all employees, regardless of their identities and backgrounds. Now, hinging from this UN guiding principles, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights also developed this standards of the conduct of businesses on tackling discrimination against LGBTI persons, which looks at core areas to work on. Number one is to respect human rights, which is also looking at how this is incorporated into vision, mission, goals, and work processes of the company.
I think Ryan is having some technical
Stakeholders or
difficulties.
partners.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, Ryan's back.
and sure. And then eliminate discrimination also in the workplace by making sure that you've got diversity in the selection teams, ensuring that there are also a policy. There's a policy that practically says that it's the employer is an equal opportunity space, or equal opportunity principle is valued in the workplace. So yeah, back to you.
Thank you, Ryan. Fire, do you have any other things to add?
Currently, while our laws are actually covering anti-discrimination as a whole, I think
Mm-hmm.
that we could go back to the implementation of these laws, right? And that's why we are pushing for specific provisions that will protect LGBT plus persons, so that the law can actually be enacted in everyone's favor and provide a real equal opportunity for everyone. So there are a lot of recommendations that have been put into place through through facilities like the United Nations, the UPR. All of these avenues are there for us to be able to enable and encourage our government to take a look at laws that will really protect us specifically. These are not special laws. I just want to
Mm-hmm.
make sure that everybody understands that, but these are laws that for now we would really need, because the implementation of what we have as an umbrella law is not something that is being honored or followed by everybody, especially in the local employment sector.
Thank you, Fire. Maybe like coming from what Ryan mentioned about the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, um, Ron, can you tell us if is this being used by the private sector as a guiding principle?
Well, yeah, I think it's very important to capture exactly what's happening out there. And from the Philippine LGBT Chamber of Commerce, I know we'll be discussing this in a few minutes, but we need to have a baseline exactly of how the business sector has implemented diversity and inclusive policies. And that's the reason why we came up with a first ever study, an index on corporate SOGIE diversity and inclusiveness index. It has to be measurable. There has to be metrics. And we need to understand that, out of all the experiences that or stories that we've heard, what kind of data are we really pushing or gathering? And we found out that ultimately we do have around 17% of Philippine-based companies that are actually have implemented diverse and inclusive policies. So I thought it's a small number. We're not yet even 50% of it, and I think there's still so much a huge room for improvement. And as we move along, I think the business sector has a role, has an obligation to ensure that it's not just for profit, but it's also about the human rights development, economic development, emotional, professional development of everything. More than the framework of human rights, I think we also have to look into the different angles of development itself. And it's not just simply saying that this is my right, we have to give it to us. But we need to explain to policymakers as business leaders, for example, that it is imperative for businesses to be a catalyst for inclusion, a catalyst for acceptance, and a catalyst for tolerance and equality. So I think we have a long way to go, and we have our study which we did back in 2018 to tell us that we are not even 50% of it.
Yeah,
Thank
Claire,
you,
if I
Ron.
may,
Chris, yeah.
I completely agree with Ron. I think we have a long way to go, especially for Filipino corporations. For example, for PFIP, we only have one Filipino corporation in our roster. So you can say that majority of PFIP member firms are international organizations. And again, in view of any law that actually mandates anti-discrimination or protects LGBT professionals in the workplace, our starting point in PFIP is always the code of conduct. So we always appeal to good corporate citizenship. And at PFIP, what we've done is to create an anti-discrimination workplace policy with specific provisions to prevent and protect employees from discriminatory acts on the basis of a person's SOGI. So that is our starting point. So we appeal again to their corporate citizenship because, to be honest, we don't have anything in terms of, again, on the legal side to support any of our initiatives.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. So since everyone has been mentioning about like the global perspective of this, how the global standards are being applied here in the Philippines, maybe we can hear from Ryan. Maybe Ryan can provide us with a context of the state of inclusion at the ASEAN level. We understand that the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus is primarily working at the ASEAN level, and it would be interesting to hear what are the challenges that the ASEAN countries are facing in being LGBTQI inclusive, and is there any ASEAN country that is becoming more progressive towards SOGIE-esque inclusivity? Ryan?
All right, thanks, Claire. Firstly, employment, access to livelihood is hinged in a broader context of human rights. And in the case of the lived experiences of LGBTIQ persons, we are facing so many challenges. Number one, the issue of criminalization. I think it's still a misnomer that it's okay to be LGBT in the context of Southeast Asia. It's not. There are policies that still criminalize consensual same-sex relations. There are policies that criminalize particularly transgender and gender-diverse persons from actualizing their own self-identity. You've got countries like Brunei that impose the penalty of death for those who have been convicted of consensual same-sex relations, punishments such as caning and imprisonment and large sums of fines being imposed to LGBT folks in Malaysia, Singapore, Myanmar, and Indonesia. Second is that there's still no legal gender recognition. There might be some improvements in some countries, such as Vietnam, or to some extent in Singapore, but it's still a very medicalized way of looking at gender recognition, unlike in other countries where self-agency is given much primary. In our context, it's still reliant in the case of doctors and medical health professionals to decide whether you are up for gender recognition or not. And then we've got the larger social stigma that exists and perpetuated by unholy alliances between political actors and extremist organizations. You can see a lot of anti-LGBT rhetoric, say in Indonesia, where a couple of years back, there has been a push for criminalization of consensual same-sex, which didn't exist in their national law. In Indonesia, you've got pockets of different provinces that criminalize LGBT, but not at the national level. Here in the Philippines, whilst we don't have a law that criminalizes LGBT persons, that conservative rhetoric is being used to block potential progressive legislations. So the context is not really good overall, and this is also amplified by the lack of a regional human rights mechanism that recognizes LGBT persons. Many years back, when ASEAN countries have been negotiating for an ASEAN human rights declaration, LGBT groups have been pushing for the inclusion of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression as amongst the protected categories in the non-discrimination principle. But what did we hear from many governments like Malaysia and Brunei? LGBT issues is a very sensitive issue. This same rhetoric is still being articulated even at this time.
Sorry. Follow-up question, Ryan.
Sure.
Have you observed any Asian country in the recent years that have become slightly more progressive in terms of their policies with regard to LGBTQI community?
Okay, so there are pockets of developments. For example, Thailand has passed the Gender Equality Act way back in 2015. Sexual orientation, gender identity is not explicitly mentioned there, but the way the government has interpreted the gender equality principles also apply to those who self-identify themselves as different from the sex assigned at birth. So that's applicable in the context of LGBT persons. There has been some cases, particularly of trans women who have used that law in order to challenge discriminatory policies in their employment. In Vietnam, there has been a move to decriminalize same-sex marriage many years back, but that law didn't actually provide legal rights for same-sex couples. Couple of years back, Vietnam likewise revised the civil code, which practically allows transgender and gender diverse persons to change their sex assigned at birth or their gender marker. But then again, there's still some confusion whether to undergo medical interventions is necessary. But so far, the government still interprets it as such, that you still have to go through medical interventions, surgeries, etc., to change the gender marker. We can also see some private companies who have recently been supportive of LGBT rights, but our critique is that this seems to be kind of prima facie support. I mean, during the Pride marches, you can see rainbows. Like a couple of days back, I've been seeing in my Facebook many companies, including not so heard of across Asia, supporting LGBT Pride Month. But then again, we don't know yet whether they have actually internalized it in their policies and employment policies and practices.
Thank you, Ryan. So I think this is a good time to move to our next question. Based on your experiences and the experiences of your organization, what are the challenges and issues that the LGBT community is facing in the workplace? So I guess we can start with Fire.
There are really a lot actually, but let me just get to the ones that we have been able to validate through research. So one of the things that we really want to look at would be compensation and benefits. For example, being able to extend healthcare insurance to a person's partner. Obviously, a lot of LGBT plus couples are not exactly married, but have been cohabitating for the longest time, and you could consider them as life partners. Unfortunately, many companies are unable to, or maybe not yet open to, speaking to their healthcare providers to provide coverage for the long-term partner of the employee or the LGBT plus employee. The other thing would also be related to that. That would be insurance. So a lot of companies provide life insurance or group life insurance to their employees. However, the specified beneficiary that needs to be on that insurance has to be a blood relative, a parent, a sibling, a son or daughter, and they are unable to enroll their partner in the insurance. So those are some of the legal things that we feel people should be able to have a choice in terms of who they would like to be on their benefits, and who would be who would actually benefit from those things that are being given by the companies. Other items, and this is also like only you've only gotten mention of this once, but in fact, even the mention of an emergency contact, there are some companies that request that the emergency contact um, aligns to what they say, is a hospital policy where the emergency contact has to be a relative. When in fact, there are, of course, people who no longer live with their relatives, who no longer live with their parents, who are in fact, cohabitating with their partners, their long-term partners. So the right to actually put that person as an emergency contact and to have that person recognized as your legitimate emergency contact is important. Other things that we've also looked at would be the actual experience in the workplace, right? So, and this is specific to folks who are more who are in the within the transgender experience. That would be the freedom to use your washroom of your gender identity. If your company has a uniform, freedom to wear the uniform of your gender identity or expression. So these are things that right now are hold question marks in terms of implementation and understanding. So it's very important for us to be able to educate our partner companies into why these policies are important. And lastly, we also took a look at the talent acquisition experience of LGBT plus persons. How is your talent acquisition experience inclusive to LGBT plus persons? Do you use a person's preferred name? We always ask for it in the application form, but sometimes we don't use it when we address them. So this is especially specific to the stigma that it can cause transgender persons, especially if they uh, do not prefer to be called using their real names or their legal names. They would like to use a preferred name. The experience of being asked to dress up within the aligning to the gender on your, or the sex on your birth certificate when you attend an interview. So these are some things that we have been able to look at in terms of experiences of LGBT persons. Even as simple as being asked in a job interview if they are part of the LGBT plus community, this should not be a question, because you being part of the community is not a measure of the skills that you can contribute to the growth of the company. So there are other things, Claire, but so far these are what have popped out of our interviews and our interactions with LGBT persons who have had interesting experiences when it comes to employment and talent acquisition.
Thank you, Fire. Actually, I just want to give a brief comment. It's interesting that the insurance issue is really one of the things that pops up in a lot of LGBT discussions. Interestingly, just recently, I think it was early this year in February, UP College of Law sponsored this discussion, and after that discussion, the Insurance Commission actually released a guideline that saying that the insurance code actually does not prohibit putting your partner as a beneficiary. So I think we can consider this as a win for the community. Something that's the something ambiguous that's being used as a means to restrict our freedom to assign our partners. It's finally been clarified. Mhm.
Yes. Claire, if I
Rod?
may,
Yeah.
yeah, if I may, on the insurance issue,
Mhm.
to simplify things, it's good business to have more clients. So I guess this is also our appeal to insurance companies, like even if you're LGBT, for example, in the company, it's of their interest to ensure that they register more applicants or more insured people in that company. So I mean, I think it has to be seen also in that economic sense that they're not losing. In fact, they're gaining more a wider clientele base for the insurance. I guess agency. So I thought that was a very good move of the insurance commission. But again, we appeal to the insurance companies that look at it in the business side. Look at it as something that's revenue generating, regardless if it's from the LGBT community or not.
Um, Chris, do you have any other things you want to share about the experiences
No,
and
just
just issues in the community?
agreeing with everything that everybody said so far, and just maybe to recap what Fire said. So at PFIP, we say that there are the three basic LGBT rights in the workplace: is the right to a name, the right to pee, and the right to dress accordingly. And so again, so we push for an inclusive, non-restrictive dress code, gender inclusive or gender neutral restrooms, and of course the right to a preferred name, especially in office correspondence, because that's really it's an important thing, especially for people who are transitioning, to be able to use the name that they are most comfortable with, to not be dead named or misgendered. That's a very, very important consideration, especially for those in the trans community.
Thank you, Chris. Ryan, do you want to add something? Okay. Fire, since you mentioned a lot of these experiences, um, how do companies react to how do companies react when employees surface these issues?
Generally, I mean, if we're And I'd like to also agree with the mention of multinational companies earlier, where if your employees have these concerns, it is a little bit easier to get guidelines and policies in place. Basically, because these companies are globalized. The global community provides for more opportunities for us to grow with them as a global company, if we are a global company. And of course, we adapt the best practices, right, of the mother company, wherever it may be. The challenge really there is in the local PH companies, where there are still certain policies that happen to go against what we are trying to put into place to be more diverse and inclusive. There is an example for, and I'm not going to really name the company, but we did talk to some LGBTI persons before, and they were telling us that their company actually has a morality clause. This morality
Mhm.
clause basically puts a stigma on you as an LGBT person, because if you are found to be part of the community, then immediately you can be removed. And there are still companies that do this, although not in paper, but in implementation by management. I mean, this adds to the stigma and the bias, the social bias that LGBT plus persons experience. So there is a lot of work to be done in terms of our local companies, and I think that it's important for them to also understand that as part of human capital development, understanding SOGI and understanding the benefit of having a diverse and inclusive workforce is something that will take you beyond a specific sphere of existence. It will take you into a more global place. It will expand the reach of your company, and at the same time expand the talent pool that you can tap. So pretty much those items.
Thank you, Fire. So you mentioned that the challenge is more on the implementing, adapting the global policies in the local counterparts. So for this, Fire, you may answer, or maybe the others also has opinions on this. What are the steps that these companies or maybe the employees are trying to use in order to influence the management to actually adapt the international policies?
I think what's really important is for management to be educated and to support
Mhm.
these policies. You can have your policies on paper, but implementation and support is really the bigger item here. If you have your policies and guidelines official on diversity and inclusion, that's definitely a huge help. But it is a bigger help if your management team actually advocates and supports these policies. So education from top to bottom is something that's very, very important. Education leads to better implementation, and let's not exclude, right, certain employees of the company. Everyone should be included in the discussion. LGBT plus persons and allies should be included in the discussion so that everybody understands the value of the result that they will be getting out of implementing these policies.
Thank you, Fire. Do the others want to add something?
Yeah, the other way is to really speak the language of business, which is ROI. So at PFIT, for example, when we would onboard like potential members, we don't just launch into a SOGI talk, but instead we start with the business of
Mhm.
inclusion. So we talk about again the business case, like what are the benefits of of really adapting a more inclusive, inclusive policies and creating inclusive spaces, and that is our launch pad to more LGBT specific or SOGI inclusive discussions. I think it's really, I mean, we have to face the reality, especially for Filipino companies, which are rather conservative, which are still run by either families or very conservative individuals. It's not very easy to talk to them about SOGI or even the concept of diversity and inclusion. So we try to appeal to their, I would say, pragmatic sense, and just really look at it from the, from that lens. Like, how is diversity and inclusion good for your business? And with fingers crossed, we hope that that progresses into a more LGBT specific conversation.
Thank you, Chris. Ron?
If I may add, Claire, I think I agree with what has been said, but I think Fire touched upon this. It's important to also, again, look at the leadership. And I think from the chamber side, for example, that's why we're looking at Philippine-owned companies, corporations, and talk at the executive management level. Because again, even if you have the staff, the employees pushing for certain changes, if the management, the executives, they don't have buy-in into the whole process, everything crumbles. So we thought that it's very important to ensure that business leadership through diversity and inclusive, again, policies are actually emanating from the top. And we're not dismissing the fact that it can also be a bottom up approach, but it's always critical to ensure leadership as we push for these reforms, and agree with the idea that multinational corporations, because they're globalized and foreign headquartered, they're way advanced in implementing all these policies. But the challenge is really on the ground, and that's why at the chamber we're pushing for more inclusivity as we gather more partnership and enterprises that are Filipino owned or allies, and then push for the agenda of the LGBT.
Thank you, Ron. Let's move on to the next question. Since we're talking about like engaging the management, how can SOGI inclusive policies be beneficial for both employers and employees? Ron, maybe you want to answer?
Okay, sure. It will be beneficial by preventing cases of the past. Remember all those sensationalized, like cases we've heard in the news about certain, like member of the trans community not being allowed to enter a particular toilet, or etc. etc. It it will be beneficial for us if we have less and less and less of those cases happening from today and into the future. So I think, and we begin by educating each other. We begin by educating the executives. We begin by ensuring that they understand that there are different expressions, different orientations. It's not just a binary world. It's not just up and down, left or right. So as we educate the people in the companies, the CEOs, we are hopeful definitely that we have this trickle down effect, and we're bringing them into the fold. As I always tell the people that we have to make sure that we do not isolate them. We embrace them by educating them on what are the different types of expressions.
Thank you, Ron. Chris, do you want to add something?
Sure, and maybe complementary to that, yes, we believe that the tone from the top is absolutely critical in pushing for diversity and inclusion in workplaces. But just as critical is really supporting the professional development of the LGBT professionals. The way that we see things at PFIP is that we need to continuously promote and amplify the voices of LGBT professionals, because it's really all about representation and visibility as well. We don't just want straight allies and male allies championing us. We want us, members of the community, representing us in boardrooms. And that is exactly what we need. If we really want to make meaningful, impactful change, there has to be more of us in those boardrooms, making those decisions, owning those budgets, and setting policies for future, more inclusive workspaces.
Thank you, Chris. Fire, do you want to add something?
Sure. I think it also boils down to providing a good employee experience or a great employee experience. I mean, at the end of the day, employee experience is for everyone. It's not just for a certain type of employee, but it's for everyone that you hire. And then when you provide that great employee experience, you will experience decreases in your attrition or your turnover. You will be able to keep your top performers. And you will be able to encourage an inclusive environment that will provide an avenue for better performance and teamwork for everyone. So I think that it's very important that we also take a look at that, that it is the experience of the employee in your company that will drive them to do their best and contribute to the growth of your business.
Thank you, Fire. Ryan, do you want to add something?
Yes, thanks.
Mm.
I do work in the context of a nonprofit organization and has been involved in many NGOs in the past. I think what we can do, at least in our sector, is to strengthen stakeholder-led advocacy. By this, I mean, number one, many NGOs rely on donors. International foundations, charity organizations, governments who provide money to different NGOs. I think it's very crucial to lobby, for example, governments, say, of Sweden, Netherlands, EU governments, etc., who do have progressive SOGIE policies to make sure that whenever they would support local foundations here in the Philippines or in Asia, that organization at the very least has an equal opportunity policy. Because sadly, not all foundations have that equal opportunity policy in place. And then second, us NGOs operate in the context of a broader community. We deal with stakeholders. It's a premise in development work that you engage and consult with your different stakeholders. Do we create space for, particularly for LGBT organization, for LGBT activists and organizations to participate in giving inputs towards the strategic plans of organizations? I think it's also a good challenge for us in the LGBT community to seize those existing spaces. Let me cite one example, because I used to be engaged in child rights work in the past. There have been many consultations with children that I have observed, and never did I hear LGBT children's issues being articulated in those spaces. Up until a couple of years back, we initiated an LGBT children's workshop, and there's a lot of issues ranging from bullying, corporal punishment, etc., that were told to us, that were shared to us, and that are being urged to be addressed. And this we use to lobby different child rights organizations in the region that, hey, you have to listen, you have LGBT children in your constituency, and that you have to incorporate their issues and recommendations into your strategic plans. So these are different dimensions where we can perhaps influence how NGOs, development organizations, can integrate SOGIE in their work.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Since we've been talking about LGBT inclusion, how do we determine which policies are SOGIE inclusive? What are our basis for saying that a certain policy is LGBTQI inclusive? Let's start with Fire.
Well, policies are LGBTI or LGBT plus inclusive if they address the needs of the LGBTI person in the company. So let's take, for example, transgender, right? So I am transgender. And currently in the company that I work for, the washroom policy supports transgender people in the sense that they actually allow us to use the washroom aligned to our gender identity. So that is one example. If it addresses a specific need of the LGBTI person or community, then it is definitely a policy, that will benefit us. Another policy I can also highlight that we have currently is our HMO insurance. So I can actually enroll my partner in my HMO as my dependent, so that they can also benefit from that same company benefit that I'm receiving as well. I'm obviously unmarried, not married to my partner, but still, they do not require us to be married. Only certain small requirements like do you live together, how long have you been together, but it still addresses the need that I have. So this is not only an LGBT plus policy, but also a policy for other unmarried couples as well. So we can also say that there are some policies that may help the LGBT employees that you have, but they may also extend to the other employees as well. But there are still some that are pretty much specific. For example, if companies have a uniform policy, so there are some government agencies that actually have uniform policies, still labeled as male and female uniforms. But at the end of the day, they actually allow you to wear whichever one you would like, depending on your gender identity and expression. So I feel that this is also a policy specific to support persons of diverse SOGI.
Thank you, Fire. Chris, do you want to add something?
Sure. So apart from what Fire mentioned, some of the best practices that I've seen personally are, leadership development programs for LGBT employees. These are specific career advancement programs that are geared towards the continued advancement of LGBT plus employees. There's also Pride sponsorship from the executive level, as we've discussed earlier, to set the tone from the top. You have LGBT plus role model programs from leadership and the management level. This is about representation and visibility, especially for self-identifying LGBT individuals in the corporate ladder. A robust LGBT Pride Network or ERG, which is funded so that they're able to, conduct activities all year round. Maybe also a strong ally network or an allyship program to really help build a culture of inclusion within the workspace. And of course, other benefits, again, aside from what Far mentioned, SOGIE-inclusive leave policies, for example, that would recognize the realities of LGBT individuals. Like, for example, there are many companies now who would recognize parental leave, adoption leave, emergency leaves, where it's regarding your a same-sex partner, for example. That's very important. Also for emergency loans.
Right.
Again, if you file for a loan, on behalf of your same-sex partner, many companies are recognizing that as well. There's also relationship and mental health counseling, specializing in LGBT plus concerns. I mean, these are some excellent examples of SOGI inclusive policies in workplaces these days.
Thank you, Chris. Ryan, do you want to add something?
Oh no, I just want to share an example in our organization because we included a policy on leaves for paid leaves for LGBT staff or employees who experience gender-based violence, and that the office would also provide support for them to access legal support, legal advice, counseling, and other health-related concerns in relation to violence they've experienced.
Thank you, Ryan. Ron?
I think any policy should be subjected to three levels. Number one is on sensitivity. A policy has to be sensitive on the needs of the employees, the staff, and everyone in the company. Number two, on the level of openness. How open are we in terms of changing what is the existing rules that are applied in the company? So, and lastly, I think it has to be also subjected to the rule of applicability. Are we applying it only to a certain group, or when a rule is implemented, it applies to all? So I think those three levels on sensitivity, openness, and applicability have to be placed so that every time we look into a certain policy, do they all apply to, do they have a check mark in these individual, I guess, levels?
Ron, you mentioned earlier that the Philippine LGBT Chamber of Commerce published the Corporate Sochi Diversity and Inclusiveness Index. Can you tell us more
Yes.
about this?
Yes, we're happy. In 2018, we did launch this first ever study on an index. So we gauged the performance of different corporations, enterprises in the Philippines, and we found out that only 17% of all the companies that we've talked to, we've provided survey forms, etc., are actually inclusive and diverse. 17%, and these are all foreign headquartered. So again, as what Fire explained, because these are globalized companies, it's easy to understand why they have already incorporated these inclusive policies. So the challenge now is to have a zero number of Philippine-owned enterprises company into 100% of whatever of whoever or whatever company we have outside to be diverse and to be inclusive. That's the reason why the Chamber of Commerce we have launched the 0 to 100 program, and we are actually inviting a lot of companies as they come to us as partners, as members, and we look into their systems. And how do we look into the system? We look at the 360-degree appreciation of what LGBT policy or LGBT friendly policies should be. At the start, during recruitment, do you already have that kind of culture you're projecting outside that, hey, we are accepting, we are inclusive, or are you just merely pink washing? When we say pink washing, love wins. Everyone is equal. Equality has to be protected. But inside, when we look into the internal processes of a company, maybe they're not really promoting these virtues, these values. So, and then also, again, 360 as they exit, as they externally project themselves by supporting other companies making statements during Pride Month, etc. So I think this is how we look at it. It has to be 360-degree appreciation of the different aspects of inclusivity and diversity. So hopefully, as the chamber moves along, as we grow our partnership and membership, we are actually moving from zero to at least, I don't know, hopefully 100 entities or 100% fully diverse and inclusive enterprises in the Philippines. We will be revising the study in I think in a year or two, but we're also happy to launch again this year what we call a sister index of that corporate SOGIE diversity index, which we will call the governance SOGIE diversity and inclusiveness index. In as much as we give the private sector the burden of making sure that the workplace is safe, we also want to make the governance, local government units, departments accountable to diversity and inclusion. So we are having that governance index for the year, and it will be a good complement to the index that we had in 2018.
Thank you, Ron. Do you have any observations as to Philippine companies that do not have anti-discrimination policies? So you mentioned that in the 2018 index that you published, there is no Philippine company that that was included there. So do you have any observations on those companies that do not have anti-discrimination policies?
We haven't been tapped by external organizations to introduce to them the like international principles on inclusivity and diversity. That's number one. Number two, it's also that sometimes these are like small companies, MSMEs. If you're an MSME, sometimes you deal with, of course, your bottom line, you have financial issues, you have human resources issues, and the tendency is to dismiss the needs of the community in as a mainstream objective for company development. I'd also like to share to you, I was talking to a conglomerate, a big company in the Philippines, Filipino-owned. I will not mention name, but when I was talking about possibility of doing that diversity and D&I policies in the company, I was told that, you know what, Ron, at the moment, we're still dealing with recruitment issues. We're still dealing with procurement concerns. The LGBT concern is not a mainstream one. It's not, it's not on our radar yet. And I was surprised because, it's a conglomerate. It's a big company, and I thought that's why we have to be really careful on pink washing when products are shown outside and commercialized as LGBT friendly. Maybe we should always go back to the source. And we are optimistic, at least from the chamber, that we need to continuously engage. We cannot be exclusive. We cannot discriminate them. We need to engage these companies because they have to be at least guided along the way to ensure that what we do at the top management level will be beneficial to the entire workforce of that particular company. So again, those are certain concerns that we've heard, and But because it's a gamut of micro, small to large corporations, the problem will always have to be how do you mainstream into the consciousness, into the bottom line of these companies, the advocacy for LGBT.
Thank you very much,
Thank you very
Ron.
much, Ron.
Let me
Let me
ask the next questions to Chris. Um, yeah. So, what's the process of PFIP in implementing SOGIE-inclusive policies in companies or private institutions?
Sure. PFIP is not an implementing body. We are a
Mm-hmm.
community of practice. So what we
Mm-hmm.
do is, we share excellent practices amongst ourselves. I remember a couple of years ago, there was really no one providing same health coverage for same-sex couples, for example. And it took one company to have that conversation with the medical provider or the health coverage provider, and everybody else followed suit. And most recently, like one company took that extra brave step of including transitioning benefits for their trans employees in their health coverage. And now we have five companies who are in the process of implementing the same benefits and privilege for their trans employees. So that's what we do. So what we do is, we look at, what are the best policies and programs out there, and we shine the spotlight on those. We share stories, and then we help out our member firms adapt these practices and localize for their respective organizations.
So, you mentioned that you are highlighting the best practices from those companies that paved the way in having more inclusive policies. Can you share what other best practices have you observed in the? So you mentioned some earlier. Do you
Yeah.
is Are there any other policies that you want to add?
Sure. I think the most impactful right now are the professional development programs that are geared towards, again, promoting more LGBT leaders. Like I said, I think we can make a lot of noise for sure, and but at the same time we cannot rely on our straight allies forever. We have to be self-sufficient. We have to be self-reliant. So I think that empowering our LGBT leaders, enabling them to take leadership roles, decision-making roles, I think that's really making an impact. We're seeing already several self-identifying LGBT CEOs and CEOs on the C levels, and they're acting as role models for young LGBT professionals. And I cannot emphasize how important that is. Again, for LGBT individuals in the workplace to see someone like them who are succeeding in the workplace, not minding their soji, but really focusing on just their strength and their character. So I think those are really important. Aside from, of course, again, constantly reviewing policies and benefits that would recognize the evolving realities of LGBT couples and LGBT families, I should say. Because I think that we're starting to see more modern families or rainbow families. So I would love to see more companies provide benefits to not just LGBT couples but to LGBT families as well.
Thank you, Chris. So we're down to our last question. This is for everyone. Um, how can companies and organizations make their policies more inclusive towards the LGBTQI community? So we've been talking about this for the whole discussion, but are there any other specific steps that the companies can take? And also, please feel free to take this time to share with us your campaigns on how your organizations are trying to influence the private sector in having more inclusive policies. Let's start with Ryan.
encourage leadership in these institutions. We also need to work on creating alternative economic spaces for LGBT persons to realize a sense of dignity, to earn money, to support a decent living. One case example in Cambodia, one of our members called Micro Rainbow International has this initiative where they provide support, technical support, to some extent financial support, to small LGBTIQ entrepreneurs, including weavers, those engaging in agriculture, those engaging in retail, etc. Give them training on how to build businesses, on how to obtain good credit standing, link them up with creditors, cooperatives who can provide microfinance, and support them in terms of accessing the bigger market. So I think we also need to look outside the big companies, the big corporations, and strengthen the social entrepreneurship capacities of LGBT persons. In that way, we can balance the discourse.
Thank you, Ryan. Fire?
Yeah, I think it's important for companies to understand how it will benefit them first of all, so that when you implement a policy and you understand how it will help your employee. It's very important for us not to just look at the policy at face value, but to understand how that impacts the person. Right, that will impact the person's personal life. That will impact their experience at work, and these are things that we should be cognizant of. Will my policy on putting a preferred name on a person's ID, will this actually help this person adapt better into the company culture? Will this help the person have better interactions or less awkward interactions whenever they deal with people inside the company or they deal with clients? These are things that are very, very important. And I think that, aside from just looking at these items as small items, it's very important for us to understand that what may be small for you may be something very huge for someone else. For example, currently where I work, my manager has been very good enough to adjust my email address to reflect my preferred name in the workplace, so that I don't feel embarrassed every time somebody would look at my email and say, oh, and then it's this long name that I don't like, right? So it really helps me. It boosts morale. It boosts your it boosts your feeling of acceptance in terms of staying with the company, and you want to stay longer and you want to do better because you feel that the company cares for you. So that's just for me.
Thank you, Fire. Ron?
Um, Thank you, Claire. I think what we tell companies is to look at the policies in three different pillars. The first pillar is on the workplace. How can we in the chamber, we always highlight the promotion of a safe workplace that affects the whole staff complement. No? So another pillar is the championing of leadership. That is always important to look at business leadership when we implement inclusive and diverse policies. And the last pillar, at least from the chamber side, is the best practices, how we recognize practices from other corporations, from other enterprises elsewhere in the globe, and implement these in their own individual capacity as company owners or executives. So I think that's what we are looking at, so that nothing will be left behind. And I guess from the chamber side, if there's like any parting words as well, we are celebrating Pride Month, and we want to reiterate to everybody PRIDE, that number one, we always look at the present, and number two we recognize that the present concerns right now have difficulties, and they have to address inclusiveness and diversity, because in the end, what we're looking at is empowering everybody. That's letter E. So I guess that's how we want to celebrate PRID. We look at the present, recognize that there are challenges towards inclusiveness and diversity, and ultimately we empower everyone.
Thank you, Ron. Chris?
For PFIP, we are enjoining our member companies to really focus on building a culture of inclusion. I mean, that's one way that we can avoid your classic box ticking, rainbow branding, and those 9 to 5 DNI agents. So we want to collect from our companies, just because they've created a corporate, pride logo or have brandish the rainbow flag on their corporate websites, doesn't mean that they're real advocates and champions. So we want to collect from them. And one way we're doing that is continuing the conversation on DNI at this time. I know many people would say, oh, why are we talking about pride? Why are we talking about inclusion at this time when there's a pandemic? Well, newsflash, the old problems never went away. If anything, the old problems have been amplified and have been compounded, by this pandemic. So we must continue the conversation on diversity and inclusion in the workplace and beyond.
Thank you, Chris. So now we'll go on to the questions from our participants, our viewers. We will be flashing the questions there. First question: a lot of global movements have given up on waiting for legal systems to protect people, and a lot of movements have also noted that laws in place seldom actually get implemented in a way that protects us. So a lot of groups have been doing their own mobilizing of resources. Would this sort of organizing work here in the Philippines? Ryan, since this is more of about mobilization, maybe you can answer this first.
Yes, I think that's why organizing plays a very important role. In the Philippines, we can see many groups across the country who have already started organizing campaigns, lobbying for local ordinances, engaging with the private sector, doing education activities to empower their respective constituents. I think we have to continue to do this work. But beyond that, we need to empower individual LGBT activists to have the knowledge, the language, and the strategy to influence key stakeholders, not just the private sector, but also the government, because policies also have an implication on how the private sector would work.
Do the others have any other thoughts on this question?
I think it's doable, it's possible.
Mhm.
I work in the public sector in the past, and
Mhm.
the reality is that sometimes it's very, very, very slow. And if the business sector, the private sector can do it faster, then no need to wait for the legal environment or the legal ordinances that can take place. But at the same time, look at some local government units. They don't have to wait for legislation at the national level. They do it as a city ordinance, and that's possible. So I think it's not just about the legal issue. It's also about there are different perspective that we need to look at it. So I guess it's doable and it can be done even if the government is way behind.
Another way, perhaps, is for us to finally focus on building the LGBT ecosystem in the Philippines. I mean, just look at the different partner logos at the bottom of the screen. If all of these partner organizations actually work together, I believe that we don't need any legislation, to move things forward. I think that there's a lot that we can do together.
Fire, do you want to add something?
I'd say that everybody's actually said it all. I mean, at the end of the day, strong partnerships create, strong results. And it's really important for us to recognize that we also can't work alone, but we should work together. So, I mean, the general message really is to partner with everyone we can partner with and make sure that we move forward with goals that we can all realize at the soonest and the goals that we can realize moving further into the future as well.
Thank you. Maybe let's flash the next question. Would you say that SOGIE education is effective in a workplace setting with employers and employees? What would be the basis factors to say so? Who wants to answer first? Maybe those in the private sector. Yeah. Okay.
Claire, yeah, Claire, I think
Ron.
you don't need to wait for the workplace to understand SOGI. If it
Yeah.
can be done at home, education begins at home, then I think it will have a greater impact to individuals.
To me, it's not about SOGI education being effective, but it being available in the workplace. So I feel like this is an important investment for workplaces to really focus on SOGI education. If they can do it twice a year for their employees, that would be fantastic because that is essential in building a culture of inclusion and understanding.
Mhm. Fire?
The foundation of coming up with guidelines and policies that will benefit all is really education. So I agree that the availability of SOGI education, whether it's in the workplace or at the barangay level or at the school level, it has to be there because right now, let's admit it, not everybody really understands the concept of soji, and we're open to misinterpretation everywhere, no matter where you look. So it's important for people to be advocates of themselves as well. Let's not rely on advocacies of organizations or advocacies of companies. We have to start looking into ourselves as well, and making ourselves into our own advocates so that we educate ourselves first so that we can educate other people and really provide an avenue for better understanding. And I think that building that foundation of information and education will eventually lead to a better understanding and appreciation, really, of everybody within the SOGI or LGBT plus community.
Thank you, Fire. Ryan, do you want to add something?
I think the government, being one of the biggest employers in this country, should take SOGI education seriously. There's an opportunity here. Government agencies have to spend 5% in terms of gender and development fund. Correct me if I'm wrong about the percentage. How much of this gender and development budget has been used for an inclusive gender sensitivity or gender inclusive education and training for civil servants? I think that's a good entry point for us in the LGBT movement to look into and engage.
Well, let's hope that the Executive Order 100 will actually be implemented in order to consolidate the plans and use the GAD funds accordingly. Um, let's move on to the next question. How do you think labor unions can help lead anti-discrimination policies in the workplace? So the whole afternoon we've been discussing about like empowering the LGBT community and also engaging the management. Now let's talk about labor unions. Who wants to answer first?
Are we all scared of labor unions? Oh, I'm just kidding. No, but it's an effective tool. It balances everything. So I don't know. Maybe we need to. They need to shift as well, because almost always the concerns of labor unions will deal with benefits, will deal with, it's extreme, and I'm not sure how much we are engaging these unions. But I think Chris will agree with this. For the employees resource groups, no, I'd like to consider them as labor unions as well, labor groups, and it's just really a matter of continuously tapping all entities out there. It can be company based, it can be a non-profit organization, it can be everyone else, and making sure that mainstreaming DNI policies is part of their agenda. So I guess it's sadly that when we talk about labor unions, we have a different perspective of labor unions from another extreme side. But everyone's a worker, everyone's a laborer. There's dignity in labor, and when we talk about dignity in labor, we talk about equality and acceptance in what we do.
Yeah, I agree with Ron. It's rather tricky when you deal with when you bring the labor unions into the conversation. Because the common argument, for example, against bringing up DNI into the table is that it's malayo sa atay. And I think everybody must have heard that already. So to me, it will require a paradigm shift. I don't have an answer, a real answer here, but from my vantage point, it may require a paradigm shift. For labor union leaders to start thinking about diversity and inclusion as also a critical element to their success, so that it becomes part of the discussion moving forward.
Okay. Fire.
I actually don't have much to add to that because labor unions are a whole discussion on their own, actually. But I think just to piggyback on what Chris and Ron said, also it's also good for us to be able to reach the labor union leaders, making sure that they understand how DNI actually is part of their world as well. So they also need to understand that there may be diverse individuals who will be part of their unions, and how will their push for policies and their request for reform and changes actually help everyone, including people of diverse SOGIE.
Mhm. Ryan, would you like to add something? Okay. If no one wants to add anything else, we can move on to the next question. How can we ensure our safety and well-being as advocates for equality in our workplaces?
Yeah,
Given that
absolutely,
LGBT
a hundred
employees.
percent.
I'm sorry. Mhm. Okay, let's proceed
Oh
with
yeah,
this next
about trade
question.
unions.
Yes, and how trade unions and
Sure.
Ryan.
Yeah, just a very quick yes,
Uh-huh.
100%. In fact, in the past 5 years,
Mm-hmm.
there's this ASEAN civil society statement that has been, developed every time there's a parallel meeting to ASEAN, and some trade unions have signed to that regional statement, which clearly indicates sexual orientation, gender identity as amongst the protected categories when we do our human rights and non-discrimination related work. But unfortunately, this is still a blind spot on our case. We haven't really mapped out which existing trade unions or labor unions have already incorporated SOGIE policies. Their work is not just about adequate salaries. We have to frame the discourse within the broader idea of safe working environment. LGBT persons, LGBT laborers have the right to be in a safe, inclusive working environment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ryan. So let's go to the next question. Unfortunately, this will be the last question that we can answer right now. We're running late. So, yes. So, how can we ensure our safety and well-being as advocates for equality in our workplaces? Given that LGBT employees may receive more harassment in our workplaces as we become more vocal and visible. Anyone can answer.
I think top of mind, Claire. I think
Mm-hmm.
number one, make sure that you take that space and you also document the advocacy you're doing in the company, just in case the management will be deciding this and that. So make sure that you when you have a dialogue with the people in the company, you make sure that they're properly documented, that you capture exactly the agreement. And that's one. Of course, it's a different case when we look at actual harassment issues. So I think that can be a human resource concern, and that if there are legal concerns that can be filed in the court, etc. But number one, it's always take your space and making sure that you also always have that dialogue within the company. So, I mean, would you want to be harassed? Would you want to be, like maltreated by your bosses? I mean, no one deserves that. And the only thing to do is to make sure that you have the voice to share these concerns when you dialogue. If there's no dialogue, then there are other venues, organizations which can help you. So I think as long as it's not illegal, you're working within the bounds of of the law, and I think you'll be protected from all these harassment.
Mhm. Who else?
Sure.
Chris?
Well, listen, nobody said it's easy, right? So I would say it's not easy being an advocate. Go easy on yourselves. Pace yourselves. Again, as Ron said, take space. But always go for it and never back down. Because definitely you will get rained down on. But as two modern day philosophers said, I'd rather be dry, but at least I'm alive.
Thank you, Chris. Fire?
I'd say that it's important for each employee to maximize the safety and security policies they have in their companies to protect them from any form of harassment. I'm pretty sure companies have guidelines around that. Also, in implementing any policies that may highlight, the benefit to LGBT plus employees, each policy should be supported by management. So again, we go to support from leadership. And at the end of the day, we also need to understand that every policy that's implemented should be, wedged on the foundations and the values of the company. So if people see that the policies are aligned towards company value and company mission statements or mission and vision, then it will be a lot easier for people to appreciate these policies as part of not only to support the LGBT plus community, but to create an environment that is accepting for all. So pretty much that's for me.
Thank you, Fire. Ryan?
Yeah, I think it's crucial that we cultivate communities of care within our community. Not all of us have all range of expertise. We have to recognize that some groups may be well versed in terms of providing legal support. Some groups may be very well specialized on psychosocial support, others on economic empowerment. We belong to this big community of care. We need to have a strong referral system so that not one activist, not one organization will be burdened to sustain the work in this challenging structural change or structural transformation that we are confronting. We have to somehow delegate our tasks, recognize each other's strength, and mutually reinforce each other's capacities. Like for example, we do have this kind of conversation. Let more conversations like this flourish. Let more collaboration flourish.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you to all our panelists. I think we can all agree that this discussion has been really productive for all of us. Now let's have Miss Joy again. Thank you so much.
Maraming salamat sa inyong lahat. Fire and Side B Philippines. Of course, Ron and Philippine LGBT Chambers of Commerce. And of course, Chris and your the group of Philippine Financial and Inter-Industry Pride. And of course, Ryan, I want your statement saying that we need communities of care. That's so beautiful. Thank you to Ryan and the ASEAN SOGIE Caucus. And of course, to our amazing moderator, Attorney Claire of Lagablab LGBT. Thank you so much to all of you. The conversation does not stop here, I hope, right? And so, on behalf of my project leads for this event, Julian Guillermo and Kit Magtoto, thank you from Asia Society Philippines. This is Joy Alampay. Happy Pride Month to everyone and stay safe.
Thank you. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride!
Happy Pride, everyone.